Emily was the wife, but not the greatest love, and that was obvious when Hussey returned to South Georgia with Shackleton. "He's to be buried here," told Hussey, where he once again was standing on board the Quest. "Emily says that he'll never get peace in some little English cemetery." And they lay him there, by the Grytviken whaling station, by the mountains and the sea and the snowdrifts, in the white wilderness of the south. It was there he was to lie, in eternity and for the moment, while the waves of the whole world broke against the beach and the winds came in from the South Pole. Among snow and ice he was to lie, and his last companions stood silently by his side. Macklin knew so much now when time had passed, and he knew that one certain love had found more room in Shackleton's breast than any other love. Emily was the wife, but not the greatest love, because somebody else had lived in his heart, one who had overwhelmed him. He had died for her. Adventure. When the ice opened, freedom would come. They would be free to put their boats in the sea and row to the nearest shore. But no freedom did exist in the thundering waters of the south, among storming waves, ice floes, winds and snow. They were rowing for days, fighting the evil currents and the deceitful darkness, but Elephant Island was so far away that it could have been imaginary. In the boat that was called the Docker, Macklin and 8 others were sitting, shivering through night after night, incapable of sleeping more than one blink at a time. As soon as he moved, his skin burnt against the deep frozen clothes, and the only thing that could keep his body warm enough to live was his comrade's embrace. During the days when rowing, exhausted, stiff, the waves were beating them and put a frozen duvet of ice over them. From their arms ice crystals fell when they rowed, from their cracking lips drops of blood. The frost dug into their hands, the salt water put boils on their skin. Their eyes failed to see, and their voices failed to speak. They used all their power for their rowing arms, and for their feet, which had to be constantly moved not to get frostbitten. Of drinking water they had none, and their tongues were swollen and as sharp as stones inside their mouths. They couldn't even swallow the food, the little food they had, and the only thing that comforted them was the blood in raw seal meat and soaking wet tobacco. They were fatigued and seasick, paralyzed and insane. They were so different from the faces he'd seen when he stepped on board the Endurance for the first time, Macklin's comrades, and he couldn't recognize them. They were so tattered and broken, so pale and so ruined, with eyes that were red. MacLeod and Cheetham were rowing like machines, without seeking and without finding other thoughts within themselves. Kerr and Nordlees were lying packed with the stores, white from seasickness. Greenstreet was sitting paralyzed with frostbite. Frozen to the helm, Worsley was sitting, staring out over the sea with foggy eyes. Macklin could do nothing for them. He was himself just as weak and cold, and the medical equipment was insufficient. They were going to die. They would die unless they could put their immovable feet on land soon, and Shackleton knew it too. He knew it, and he didn't think about anything else. He knew it, but he refused it. Through the storms, Macklin could see his silhouette, sitting stubbornly at the helm of the James Caird, with one hand on the rope which towed the third boat. He saw him, and then he saw him no longer. The Docker was separated from the other 2 boats that night, staggering over the frenzy of the sea. They were separated, and they limped away over the waves in a darkness which ate them alive. The others had perished, because that was the only thing they could believe, and long was that night, longer than any other. But a grand sight met their flickering eyes when the morning sun peered through the mists, a sight so enormous Elephant Island rose from the sea in front of them. Along its ragged cliffs and tumbling glaciers, by its hostile storm-swept peaks, they took their tiny boat over the foam until they found a small, safe shore. They found a protected beach, and by the beach they found Shackleton and the two boats. "They made it," Macklin whispered. "We made it. We're alive." They were alive, but they were almost dead. Southwards the quest followed the waves, over shining clear waters that mirrored the sky. The air was fresh, crackling fresh, and spotted with 100 playful snowy white terns. Icebergs, mighty and proud, were lulled by the waves, pondering. Their bodies that disappeared into the deep were completely blue. Their magical shapes reached fairy-like for the skies. The surface of the sea was sparkling with seals. Whales were blowing. "It almost hurts," Worsley mumbled. "What?" asked Macklin, who stood beside him by the gunwale. "This grand beauty." Worsley was handsome, and his eyes were full of poetry. Gone was the Worsley who lay in the docker, unable to straighten his petrified body, dressed in rags and with a twisted face. "Deceitful but grand," he said. "They say we're crazy who return here, but what do they know? If they had ever been here, they'd understand." He went to the bridge after that, called by his work. Macklin looked at him. How safely Worsley navigated now, how securely and simply, almost without thinking. Back then he had had a small compass, a chronometer, and a worn sextant, but likewise he had succeeded. In his head Macklin could see a little shabby boat, the James Caird, which disappeared from the beach over the kingdom of the sea. From Elephant Island it sailed with 6 men to seek help, over the wildest waters of the globe, a 2 weeks' journey to South Georgia. It was impossible for it to make it, but Shackleton sat at the helm, and he was invincible. And Worsley, with his little compass, his chronometer, and his worn sextant, managed to guide them through mists and gales, between the crests of enormous waves, with ice damaged by salt. They wouldn't make it, but they made it. Hurley had taken a photograph of them when they left the island, forever standing there with his camera, and Macklin had seen the picture so many times that he could develop it in his head only by closing his eyes. He could see a little group of men on the rocky beach, with arms hopefully in the air, waving to the disappearing boat. Their trust and their lives had been put in a tiny torn lifeboat, a speck on the frozen waters of the gales. It wouldn't make it, but it did. Then Macklin moved his eyes from the boat to the men, to those who stood on the beach with waving arms, ill, broken, stranded. He couldn't get them out of his thoughts. "What is it?" Wilde was standing beside him suddenly, with the wind in his face, looking at Macklin. "You're not sad, are you?" "No, I simply feel such emptiness," Macklin replied quietly. "And I'm not only talking about the boss, I'm talking about all of them. How could we possibly know, when we stood there on Elephant Island, that McCarthy would survive everything, only to be killed in the war a few weeks after enlisting?" "A waste of a truly good man," Wilde whispered, but he didn't want to talk about it. He walked away over the deck, and Macklin could see a small bottle stick out from his pocket. A true waste of a good man, Macklin thought. A true waste. And the icebergs nodded.